This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then Notes on Resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Hello, welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky, and our guest today is Chris Marshall. He's a futurist, a speaker, and an author, and we had an amazing conversation about how the world is changing and building emotional fluency, how to step back from chaos and noise, and we even talked about self-compassion as a biohack. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Look for us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe, and if you like the podcast, please leave a review. Thanks. Hi, Chris. I'm so excited to be talking to you today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Awesome. So before we get started into who are you and why are we talking, I want to know if you could have a superpower, what would that be?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it would have to be if I could snap my fingers and let somebody see inside their brain and see what's going on with all the chemical reactions. I know this sounds really nerdy. It's probably the most nerdiest superpower you've heard on the show. But if you could do that, people would instantly see, oh my word, like all of these different pathways are lighting up and these chemicals are coming through. As you can see, I'm quite passionate about this. And it would just allow people to go, oh my word, it's not me, it's my wiring or it's my brain doing this. And I think that's going to probably become evident where our conversation goes, why I think that would be such a superpower to be able to either have or give people.
Wow. So I don't think it's nerdy because I think that's really cool and I want that superpower too. And I love that part of having that superpower would be helping people see this is a natural response. This is how your brain works.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that's one of the things that I think we just confuse, that we do something, we get anxious over something doesn't go our way. And there are so many different options we have, but rarely do we just go, oh, actually, this is just a wire. This is just a wire in my brain creating this thought, because then that allows us to be far more compassionate, far more self-reflective, rather than, oh, I'm a terrible person.
Yes. That is so often where so many of us go, straight to there is something wrong with me. So, well, tell us about you, Chris. Who are you? What do you do?
Oh, it's always a big question.
That is a big question. So answer as you see fit.
Okay. Well, I normally describe it as I spend my life standing in two very different camps.
Okay.
One is I'm a global investment strategist and futurist. That's one camp. So I look at how the world's changing, what's going on, what's driving change. And that was really the starting point behind the book that I published last year called Decoding Change. Then the other camp I sit in is I'm a behavioral scientist and obsessed with things like performance psychology and neuroscience and how we think, how we construct our decisions, how we construct our thoughts. For me, what's been interesting over the last kind of 10 years or so is those two camps have come together for me in that how the world's changing, it's just as important to understand how we think. You can't, as far as I'm concerned, understand how the world is unfolding or how it might unfold without understanding how we react to it. And so that's really kind of where I have this kind of nickname, the uncertainty scientist, And that's really where a lot of my most fascinating work comes in. Probably where our conversation will go today is kind of that thought piece about what uncertainty does and why it's so challenging to us as a human.
Yes. I love that that's how you see the world and what you think about and how you help others see the world. And I think that uncertainty that you're talking about, I think that ties very nicely into the concept of resilience and what is it that puts somebody in a position where they need to be thinking about their own resilience. So what do you think about resilience and that concept, and how does that intersect with your work?
Okay, that's a really good question. So I think probably it pays to take a step back, if that's all right, and just kind of explain why I'm so fascinated with uncertainty in our decision making, and resiliency will come into that.
Okay.
And the kind of the backstory to that is we live at this incredibly pivotal moment in human history. This is my thesis. You don't have to believe this. But from all the work I've been looking at, I mean, first of all, we like to believe that the world just steadily progresses. It steadily changes. Every day we just chip away and it just changes very slightly. That's actually not the case at all. It does, but then we go through these periods of rapid change. So paradigm shifts. And these paradigm shifts, they can come from technology. So we could throw in disruptive technologies like AI and machine learning, but they could also come from a global order change. They could come from a change in demographics. They could come from a changing natural environment. And what's really interesting today is we have all of these different trends and megatrends all on the move. And they are all running to this seeming time frame, which says in the next couple of decades, we're going to see change in every single area. We can actually add to that, we're seeing a change in cultural philosophy, which is one of the biggest changes that we have ever seen in history, when the culture and its underpinning values and beliefs suddenly move. So that's kind of the backdrop. That was kind of, again, the point of writing the book, Decoding Change, was to help people see this change. Because it's something that bizarrely we're not taught. We're not taught how the world changes.
Right.
Even though it's probably one of the most fundamental things we need to know, particularly when we're at that point of massive change.
Right.
And the reason that resilience now comes into that is resiliency. I mean, firstly, let's put a definition around it, because everybody has a slightly different definition.
Yes, we all do.
It's essentially being resilient in the face of stresses, not being overwhelmed, we could say, or overloaded. Because your brain and my brain and everybody else's brain has a maximum capacity. It can only process so much. And then it goes, oh boy, I'm a bit tired, I'm fatigued, I'm drained. This is enough for me. And so we take lots of shortcuts. So we oversimplify, we could say, in our thinking. We can't take in every single bit of data which is thrown at us. We have to be selective. A really easy example is if you're going out shopping for a new mobile phone, you don't actually look at all the specs. You look at enough of them to go, oh, well, that's all right for me. That meets most of the criteria. That's essentially simplifying the decision problem.
Okay.
We then run with that. Okay. And this is where we get into some real kind of maladaptive processes and some real biased thinking, is that we run with that simplification. Now, in a rapidly changing world, that oversimplification can run us down some very interesting paths, because we believe one thing and actually reality is something completely different.
Yeah.
And so what we're really talking about is a process that our brain is doing to help us cope in the world. But the modern world, when we start turning up that dial of change, of turbulence, of uncertainty, all of a sudden we're in this environment where our brain is starting to really feel drained. And if you ask most people, like, do they feel like the world's changing? In fact, I'm quite mean. Like, if you ever end up in an audience when I'm speaking, I'll typically ask these questions. You'll be tipped off, and so will the audience now, which probably ruins my stage effect. But I typically ask people, put your hand up if you feel like the world's changing. Everybody shoots their hand up. Like, there's virtually nobody left who's like, no, I don't think so. And then you go, okay, well, here's a tougher question. Can you pinpoint where change is coming from? And like, you just see everybody's hand come down. And like, there's one or two really brave people.
Right.
The point is that change is coming from every direction.
Yeah.
And we are just in this kind of this fog, this muddy place of like, oh my word, what does this mean? And so when we come back to that kind of point of resilience, resilience in this scenario, when we're looking kind of about the uncertainty around us, is being able to step back and not get caught up. That's where resiliency comes in for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's all too easy to be, we are taught to be hyper specialists. What I mean by that is from the moment we're born, we're almost funneled into this like hyper specialization through our schooling, through our college, through our work, through our experiences. And we end up knowing loads and loads about 3 millimeters of life
Mm-hmm.
and very, very little about the rest. But when the world's changing at this pace, actually what we need to do is we need to stand back. We need to become generalists. And that, I believe, is also linked with resiliency in fast-paced environments, is being able to step back from the chaos, from the noise, and to actually get some calmness and clarity to thought, which are actually incredible moments. I'm sure you've had them where you just kind of have those moments where you're just like, oh, I can think.
Yes.
Which becomes rarer and rarer the faster the environment you are in. So for me, resiliency is about clarity of thought and really high decision making, really high quality decision making.
Wow. I like thinking about it that way. It sounds like, I'm not going to say the opposite of resiliency, but I'm going to say that it sounds like what people are dealing with now just generally is a lot of overwhelm and burnout, and that building on your own resiliency is something to counter that. Am I hearing that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of think we've on the street. I mean, so again, when we kind of come down to definitions of resiliency, we have very different resiliency definitions with academia than you do on to the layperson.
Yes.
And I think the layperson kind of runs around with this idea of resiliency is like bad things happen to me and I don't move. That seems to be the common perception, which is, I don't believe, right. That's just called emotional suppression,
Right.
which I don't think is healthy. We're meant to experience the full range of emotions. But where kind of a lot of my work looks at is how well can you bring yourself back down from a stress state? But essentially, when we become overwhelmed, when we start becoming that kind of, let's talk about burnout, let's talk about that kind of overload, cognitive overload of just too much data, too much stuff on our plate, not enough rest. Lifestyle factors play into this, in terms of both metabolic stress, physical stress, emotional stress is probably the number one. And what's happening is our brains are becoming, they're basically being soaked in cortisol and other stress hormones. And what we actually find at those moments is that you become more emotional. Our emotions are more extreme.
Yes.
Our decisions are more extreme.
Yes.
We become more defensive. We become far more rigid. We become less inventive. We become less cooperative with others. All of these different things, which we kind of pin down as saying these are the best human qualities.
Right.
And so when we actually look at emotional suppression, actually what we find is it doesn't tend to be the same as emotional fluency. So emotional fluency, just being able to move through these different states from stress through to calm. Emotional suppression tends to lead to a lot of kind of self-critique and anxiety, which actually builds on the stress. So there can be negative feedback loops in it.
Right.
So yeah, resiliency for me is that ability to step back. And that's a cognitive process. That's a conscious process saying, this is too much. I'm aware of what's happening inside me.
Right.
I'm going to pull back from it. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to pause. And I don't think our modern world teaches that enough.
Yes. I'm just thinking back to a recent experience I had where I was overwhelmed with emotions, something that was going on. And somebody helped me kind of take a deep breath and take a step back. And I was able to do that thanks to the prompt from outside, and then was able to think clearly about what was happening. Whereas just moments before, I was utterly overwhelmed and had no idea what my next step was.
Yeah.
So I appreciate hearing some of the science behind that too, and kind of what's going on. No.
Well, let's dig into that because that's a very, very common response. It's again, let's come back to what I said right at the start. It's a wire, it's a chemical reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, what would happen if I was able to have that superpower I talked about is what we'd start to see happen as you come to that state of stressed out, let's say. So you're kind of at max.
Yes.
You turn the dial all the way up and it's like, oh my word, the world's about to end. And to your brain and your body, that's exactly how it's responding. The world is about to end. It's in survival mode. Okay,
Yes.
so these stress responses we have are so important. They're not something we should get rid of. They are very, very carefully honed processes which allow us to get out of situations. The issue in our modern world is that we have lots of triggers which aren't actually life-threatening.
Yes. Yes.
And we don't actually need to switch on that fight or flight response, which kept us safe from a lion or a bear or a wolf thousands of years ago. So if you were able to dive into your brain at that moment when you were kind of like, oh my word, this is way too much. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's going on anymore. Likely what you would have seen is one region of the brain, which we know is very important for this kind of rational processing, rational thought, the prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
Is actually cortisol, the stress hormone, actually starts to sever the connection.
Ugh.
And what you find is the amygdala really kind of is in control here with massive negative emotions. It is biased towards being pessimist because tens of thousands of years ago, that kept us alive.
Mm-hmm.
It paid for us to be, oh, well, if I'm stressed out, it's better to be negative than optimistic. And so actually, you're absolutely right. Sometimes you need that external voice just to go, just take a minute.
Yeah.
And it's enough to snap you out of it for a second and just go, oh. And within a few seconds, all of that chemistry starts calming down.
Yeah.
And if you actually breathe deeply, then you start to actually see those cortisol levels come down and you start to see kind of more normal, rational functioning occur.
Right. You know, I think one thing that you said in there is so important for us to remember, which is these responses are what our brains are supposed to be doing. Now, whether or not we're responding to an actual life-threatening danger or not, that's something we do need to be kind of working on for ourselves. But these are natural responses of the brain to deal with what it sees as an emergency. And Chris, I want to kind of broaden the discussion because we have been talking about our brains and what's happening neurologically in this moment and the importance of resilience from my perspective to be resilient as I'm dealing with things. Do you see a role of our systems and institutions and the organizations that we're part of in supporting that resiliency in themselves being resilient so that they're not thwarting us as we're trying to express our own individual resiliency?
I think we can broaden that out even further. I think we all have a responsibility to each other to build our resiliency, whether that's an organization, a government, an individual, a co-worker. And I hope that's kind of where the world's going. Kind of one of the trends that I see going on, putting on my kind of futurist hat for a minute, mm-hmm. is I believe we've come through this period, which I kind of term the age of measurement. Mm-hmm. Since the 1970s, when we invented this tiny little thing called the semiconductor, which powers nearly everything that we call life now, we've really just got really, really good at measuring stuff. That's been the secret, and storing it and making these big databases and everything else. And now what's happening, well, certainly in the last 10, 15 years, is we're starting to use that data and bring awareness, which is very different. Awareness is very different to data collection. So I dub the next era that we're moving into, or already in, I'd say, as the age of awareness. And the age of awareness isn't just about, corporations have a more sustainable outlook, or they want to have less impact on the natural environment. It's not just about, where do you buy your clothes, and are they carbon free, or are they, kind of whatever, how many air miles have they done?
Right.
Awareness is about wellness as well. This is where we see things turning. And so I think corporations in the future, I'm going to turn this around to productivity in a minute and innovation. But I think where corporations really have a role is they're starting to see this awareness is filtering through into corporations, that when their employees and staff are at their best, the work they do is incredible. Mm-hmm. And when they're not, it not only costs them in days off, days sick, burnout, all these different things, but there's also massive underproduction. And I think COVID probably helped this move along, because we were kind of stuck in this old paradigm in many businesses where it was like, well, if you work for us, you turn up at 9 o'clock and you leave at 5 p.m.
Yes.
Which is just a hangover from the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's literally, those were the daylights, and we could see you come in and pull a lever in like 1700.
Right.
We don't need to do that anymore. We have lights. And COVID kind of shook that up and went, well, you can work from home. And all of a sudden, if you're working from home, well, why do these hours now fix? And then you start getting into kind of like, well, what are the hours that work best for me? And when am I most productive? But I think from the point of view of resiliency and corporations, I'd say that hopefully what we're moving to is beyond resiliency. Resiliency to me is coping. And I think there's something beyond that's called flourishing. And I mean, obviously, resiliency is still very, very important when we come to stressors. But in the everyday, I think that's what we should be aiming for, is flourishing rather than just coping.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people are just coping right now. And where corporations are going to get smart to this, very smart, is they're going to start seeing, okay, let me ask you a question. Where do you have your best thoughts? Are they in the office? Or are they out walking? Are they in the shower? And are they on the beach? Are they talking with friends? Normally, again, if I'm really cruel in the middle of a talk, nobody puts their hand up to the office unless they're sat next to the boss, actually.
Right. Yes.
Like, yeah. But everybody then puts their hand up as soon as you start saying, oh yeah, it's for me, it's out running, or for me, it's showering, for me, it's out for a walk with the dog, or it's wherever. It's got nothing to do with the situation. It's got nothing to do with the activity.
Right.
It's got to do with what we were talking about before with our brain state.
Right.
We're in the opposite place of stress. We're now in joy or calm.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in joy or calm, you have access to everything in your brain. Everything works smoothly. Mm-hmm. You can be cooperative. You can be empathetic. This is where you get abstract thought. This is where you get breakthroughs. And it's such a magical place from a decision-making point of view that corporations are, I believe, getting smart to this. That's why we see them playing around with working hours, with days off, with making offices more entertaining. I mean, so far, all they've done is add colors and slides to open plan offices, which probably isn't very great, but they're trying. And so resiliency I think, is incorporated into that, because they start to understand that when they can actually serve their employees best, mm-hmm. they themselves benefit.
And in light of what you just said, I find it fascinating that we are starting to see stories in the press about companies that are saying, nope, everyone has to come back to the office now. Enough of this, falderall. We need you back in the office. If you aren't going to come back in the office, then these are, you can't work for us anymore, et cetera. And I find that so fascinating that there are organizations that are so entrenched in that old way that even the benefits that I would imagine even those companies saw during COVID somehow don't drown out the noise for them.
Yeah, I'd just say good luck to them. I mean, it's a big experiment to play, isn't it?
Yes.
No, I mean, on a serious note, I kind of get it. As humans, there's one thing we love more than anything else. And particularly if we're stressed. And when I say stressed, I don't actually mean, we're stressed out. I just mean this low-lying level of stress, which I'm going to say 99% of people around today have.
Yeah.
And we get it from lifestyle factors, and we get it from everything else. And when we have that low-lying level of stress, we start to love the status quo. We start to love the familiar. We don't like change because that's dangerous, according to our evolved brain. And so there's a massive draw for everybody. I mean, you see this in all walks of life, not just corporations, but people go back to old habits.
Yes.
Because it's familiar and it's a safe ground. And coming back to those wires, that's what we associate with a memory. We just start reactivating those wires again. So I'm not surprised to see it. But again, hopefully those companies that do are very aware of what's going on, would reverse it again if they started to see their employees start to suffer, or they started to lose market share. It's probably the market share one.
Exactly.
Don't want to make them change their mind again. But
yes. As much as I think about a workplace as a community, and it's a place where we people spend time, so it needs to be supportive and trauma sensitive and all of these things. A company exists for the most part for the bottom line, to make money, to accomplish something. It doesn't exist just to take care of the people who are part of it. So I can understand that there's a potentially really large push and pull between those forces.
I mean, let's just tackle that for a second, because I mean, that is a really interesting point you pull up there. And the two are linked. So again, I mean, there's loads of studies where companies with better culture are more profitable. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a really interesting slice of kind of business and economics, because as you say, most people kind of criticize the profit mechanism, saying, oh, well, yeah, corporations are just there to be profit making and greedy and everything else. And they don't really care how they get there. Well, actually, when you start really looking at that, they have to care how they get there.
Yeah.
Not only because you and I as a consumer, in this age of awareness, let's bring it back to that, you and I as a consumer are being far more detailed in how we scrutinize a business. Mm-hmm. When we're starting to ask questions about, well, you know, kind of how do you do that? Or how do you make it? Where's it come from? Mm-hmm. And what the process is. But also companies are starting to become aware, as we've been talking about, their lifeblood is the creativity and the output of their staff. Mm-hmm. And I honestly believe the companies that survive this massive paradigm shift that we're about to go through are the ones most attuned to that. And the ones who aren't will likely fall by the wayside.
Interesting. Wow. Thank you for your perspective on that. So if we go back to sort of the personal experience of this, you know, how can our listeners kind of build a mindset that helps us deal with all these rapid changes and this low level of stress that you said basically 99% of us are dealing with all the time right now, and probably makes it hard for us to make certain kind of decisions? What's our best next step for ourselves as individuals?
I think the starting step for anybody is just awareness. It can be seen as a very throwaway statement, but it isn't. Kind of building inner awareness is a lengthy process. It takes time. Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate. So kind of my background, I think probably where a lot of this fascination came from is I was a youth athlete. I was represented Britain on the British ski team as a youth. And I got this opportunity to actually come out to your beautiful country and go up into the mountains in Killington. And there's a school up there called the Killington Mountain School, which combines skiing and schoolwork. And it was there I met this sports psychologist. And he was the one that really introduced to me at age 13 or 14 that there's a mental game to sport as well as a physical game. Mm-hmm. And that really started with kind of lots of visualization and imagery and meditation and things like that. But it was building that awareness that was so fascinating. And I kind of know it through my own personal life, how powerful that can be. So I'm autistic. And so essentially one of the things that means, I was going to say the thing, no, it's just one of the things, is I'm naturally prone to anxiety. Kind of, I sometimes describe myself as the canary in the coal mine in a fast moving environment. I should be the one that burns out every day.
Yes.
But thankfully, due to the research and the tools that I kind of have built and used for 20, 25 years, I don't. And so the awareness is the starting point. And that can be, you don't have to suddenly become like a meditation guru.
Yes, that's what people are afraid of, I think.
Yeah. It can be as simple as, so for me, how this plays out in a day-to-day life is I go for a walk. That's it. I make sure I go by myself. I don't take an audiobook. I don't take headphones. That was actually a really big move for me. I used to go for a walk with entertainment.
Okay. Yeah.
By the way, you don't get to know yourself if you're listening to an audiobook. I should be plugging audiobooks, but for this purpose, no, just pause. And that's the way I kind of check in with myself each day. It's probably the most productive 30 minutes of my day, where I just walk. I'm very, very lucky where I live in that I can walk through a small forest down to the sea. And it's idyllic, but even if I'm in the middle of a city, I will still make sure I just go and find a park, find anywhere where you can just step back. It's the actual physical version of mentally checking out for a minute. And what you find is as you just spend time with your thoughts, they start to just come through. And it's almost like I have this kind of image in my head of like when I was young and there was this process on old computers, which you defragmented the disk.
Oh gosh, I
don't know how
remember that.
and it had little lines, little colored lines. Well, that's how I kind of think of my walk. So that's the starting point. It's really easy to do. For somebody else, it might actually be swimming. It can be anything. It's just it's just you, time alone. Actually, it's a bigger ask for a lot of people than what I've just said, because we actually hate being alone with our thoughts.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of a study that was done about 10, 15 years ago, where they sat people in a room and they gave them the option of sitting there alone for 15 minutes with nothing or electrocuting themselves. I think it was about 68% of people administered electric shock just to entertain themselves. So being alone with our thoughts is something that we don't particularly always like to do.
Yes.
Because there's an honesty and a slight amount of courage sometimes to diving in there and going, how did I do with that? Or where did I go? Yes. From there, once you've built that kind of that regular routine of stepping back, I mean, that in itself can be life-changing for people.
Yeah.
It's just checking out for that short amount of time. But from there, it's then about building things like a tolerance for uncertainty. And you can do that again by, it's kind of mental games. Just going, well, how would this thing triggers me? When uncertainty builds here, I'm triggered emotionally. What would happen if I acted as if I had massive tolerance for uncertainty? What would happen if I didn't do that? How would I respond and how would I feel? And one of the most amazing things about our brain is this thing called plasticity. And that is that it changes. Yes. And we can change it. It is the most incredible process we have, that the wires we set down, so when we're in a big emotionally triggered event, we lay down a wire. But it doesn't mean that wire has to remain there. We can choose to go in, and sometimes it's a lengthy process because some of these wires we build through habits and everything else for decades, but we can change them.
I love the concept of going for a walk as kind of that pattern interrupt that will also reset. And I have defragged many a hard drive in my time. I now can picture that image, and I really like thinking of that. It kind of cleans everything up and you could see it, and it was very exciting to see that progress. Thank you for sharing that. And so we've talked about and I know there are many more things this is kind of a starting point, is the awareness and maybe doing that, going for a walk or doing something to interrupt that pattern. What do you think is the most important action or policy that an organization can do to be supportive of resiliency?
I think it's bringing that awareness from the self that we've just talked about to an awareness at the corporate level. And that will potentially look different for every organization. But I don't think it's beyond the tools we have in our modern society to actually delve in on an individual basis and be very personal, rather than this, again, traditional approach of broad brush. And I think the broad brush approach really was there just because, again, we didn't have the tools. If we go back 100 years, we didn't have the tools to personalize everything to everybody's individual needs, but we do today. And I think that's the next step in kind of everything we've talked about, is that personalization. So, I mean, for me, I know that I work far better very, very early in the morning. I will schedule all of my deep work. So if I'm working on anything where I really have to put in effort cognitively, I will schedule that first thing, because I know I have 4 or 5 hours in the morning where I can race through stuff. Whereas if I attempted to do that in the afternoon, I actually it isn't just I do a bad job or I'm slower. It actually affects me all night. Like I'm then shattered for doing the same task. And that's a very, very simple kind of example of just personalization. Again, I'm very fortunate in that I do have some autonomy over my time in the business I work in. And I realize that some others don't, but that's where the corporation comes in, isn't it?
Yes.
And they just kind of go, okay, well, let's trial this. And I think that's all we need, is businesses just to be brave enough to go, let's give it a go. And let's see where we get to. So for me, it's personalization and checking in and using modern technology to assist us in doing that endeavor.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are getting very close to the end of our time. Chris, what's one question that I didn't ask you that you wish I had? And then how would you answer it?
Oh, one question. Do I only get one? No, I'm joking. I think for me, one of the biggest topics I talk about is just how the biggest existential threat to humanity is our thinking. I'll kind of clarify that because it sounds like a really kind of dangerous and dark topic.
It does.
But I'm an optimist for the future. And I base that on all of the work and research that I put into not just the book, but my job as well as a futurist and investment strategist on that side. Is one of the things that you cannot deny is when you look through human history, we are the most adaptable, innovative, creative creatures going. Mm-hmm. We just are insanely well suited to that kind of abstract thinking, those breakthroughs. And the issue is, or the sad thing is, that the one thing that stops that, the one thing that takes away our superpower, talking about real superpowers, that is our real superpower. Yeah. And the one thing that takes that away is stress. You flip from being adaptable, innovative, and creative, and you become rigid, closed-minded, and often aggressive. And you see that around us all day, every day, of people in very, very extreme emotions. And I don't deny that we have some massive hurdles ahead as a human race. We really do. We have some challenges up ahead, but we can overcome all of those, I honestly believe, if we can be in our best state.
Yeah.
And so that's where I say that the real threat to humanity is not from the climate. It's not from demographic changes. It's not from nuclear war. It's not from any of these other things. We can overcome every single one of those. At least we can adapt to every single one of those. But we won't do it if we remain in this stressed out state.
Yeah. Wow. Chris, this is such a fabulous conversation, and it's giving me some hope, which I appreciate.
Good.
As we're getting ready to wrap up, what would you tell your 18-year-old self about resiliency?
Oh, I think it'd have to be self-compassion. Mm-hmm. That for me, again, is kind of one of the things we often overlook as part of the resiliency framework is self-compassion. We fixate on control and everything else. But self-compassion is such a key thing. It's also the thing. So again, I'm going to bring this back to the brain states. When we're in this lowest stress state or calm or joy, as some researchers would call it, mm-hmm. That's when we're the most connected to others. We are empathetic. We are intimate even. That's kind of where intimacy lies. And you can't be in those states and not be self-compassionate.
Right.
In fact, self-compassion can be a shortcut to getting on because we can use it as a kind of a biohack in modern jargon.
Right. I like that.
But self-compassion is so important. And it allows you to make failures or stumble across failures. It allows you to do things which you look back and kind of go, okay, well, that wasn't great. But that's actually a function of humanity. You don't have to single yourself out and go, oh, I'm so bad. I'm such a failure. I'm such a loser or whatever else kind of goes through your head. You can just go, actually, I'm experiencing what it is to be human.
Yeah.
That to me is self-compassion.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So, Chris, how can our listeners reach you?
So probably the best way is through my website, which is just theuncertaintyscientist.com, or through LinkedIn. Look me up and DM me there. It's Chris Marshall. But yeah, theuncertaintyscientist.com has most of my kind of work and blog posts and tools. There's actually something that might interest your listeners, which is called the Tolerance of Uncertainty quiz that I have on there, which is kind of just 10 questions. And it just scores you of do you have a high, medium, or low tolerance of uncertainty? Because this is really what a lot of my work focuses on that side, is how well suited is your thinking at the moment to rapidly changing environments. So yeah, people, if they just go to The Uncertainty Scientist, they can find all they want about me and probably more.
Excellent. And I'll put a link to all that in the show notes so it makes it easy for everybody. Chris, thank you so much. This has been such an amazing conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinski.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinski, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.